This is a follow-up to the video entitled Jack the Ripper, the Forgotten Suspect, which profiled Charles Allen Lechmere, who was caught in flagrante at the freshly killed body of Polly Nichols. If you haven't yet seen this video, it's linked in the description below. While Lechmere is certainly an excellent suspect, there are many others. In this video, we will round up the usual and unusual suspects. Our roundup begins at the most unlikely and fantastic end of the spectrum, with a theory that became fashionable in the 1970s and 80s, particularly in film and television, that implicated the British royal family, establishment, and/or Freemasons as being behind the murders. Prince Albert, Duke of Clarence. It hardly seems worth pointing out that the Prince was not Jack the Ripper, but such is the allure of the establishment conspiracy, some still entertain the theory that the murders took place to cover up illicit behaviour and illegitimate heirs. Albert was not in London when the murders were committed. His involvement is impossible. Sir William Gull. Queen Victoria's personal physician, Gull has been portrayed in film, galloping around Whitechapel in a mysterious royal coach to carry out the foul deeds. Unfortunately, Gull was in his 70s at the time of the murders and had recently had a stroke. Setting aside the fantastic theory, the killings would have been physically beyond him. J.K. Stephen. Stephen was a tutor to the aforementioned Prince Albert. His only qualification as a Ripper suspect were a series of rambling personal writings that were both misogynistic and psychopathic. He is every bit as bad a suspect as the others. Walter Sickert. The last major suspect in the establishment theory, Sickert was a celebrated and well-connected painter. In 2002, American crime writer Patricia Cornwell made a wild claim that he was Jack the Ripper, based on something she had seen in his paintings and some slipshod DNA work that supposedly linked him to one of the 600 or so Ripper letters held by Scotland Yard. The fact that Sickert was in France for at least 2 of the murders didn't deter her. Independent analysis of the DNA further rubbished her theory. The establishment, royal family, and Freemason conspiracy is now firmly in the realms of Hollywood and fiction. Montague John Druitt. Druitt was a barrister and schoolmaster who was dismissed from his school and then committed suicide. His family had a history of mental illness. He only became a suspect because his suicide coincided with the presumed end of the murders. There is no other link, and he was known to have been in Dorset when one of the murders occurred. Michael Ostrog. Ostrog was a Russian-born conman and thief who was first mentioned in the McNaughton Papers, a compilation of tips and suspects that was produced years after the murders. He was never seriously considered by police at the time, and may well have been in prison in France when the crimes occurred. John Pizer, aka Leather Apron. Pizer has the distinction of being the only man ever officially named by the police as Jack the Ripper, before a humiliating climb down by the authorities. He had been arrested by a Sergeant William Thick, who was said to have a personal grudge against Pizer. Detectives quickly released him, when it became clear that in addition to a lack of evidence, he had solid alibis for 2 of the murders. Pizer received financial compensation from at least one newspaper who named him. Carl Fagenbaum. Fagenbaum was a German sailor who committed a murder in New York. After his execution, one of his lawyers claimed that Fagenbaum had confessed to him that he was Jack the Ripper. The lawyer's partner denied that Fagenbaum had ever even mentioned the killings to him. As a sailor, Fagenbaum could well have been in London when the murders occurred, but there is nothing to say that he was, and no evidence to connect him to the crimes. Dr. Neil Cream. Neil Cream was a Victorian serial killer, both in the US and the UK. His later presence in England led to speculation that he was a valid suspect. However, it emerged that he was in prison in Illinois at the time of the murders, so could not have been the killer. Frederick Bailey Deming was another serial killer who was hanged in Melbourne for the murder of his second wife. He had also killed his wife and family in England and fled to Australia via South Africa. Rumours circulated that at his execution he had blurted out that he was Jack the Ripper. However, this is disputed, and he was almost certainly in South Africa when the crimes occurred. George Chapman. Chapman was another murderer who was on the loose in the East End at the time and has attracted suspicion. He poisoned 3 wives, but since poisoning was his MO, it seems unlikely that he would have drastically changed that MO to carry out the Ripper murders. William Henry Berry. Berry had murdered his wife, a former prostitute, in a gruesome manner very similar to the Ripper killings. He had also lived in the East End in the right time frame. He seemed like a very interesting suspect. However, while he freely admitted killing his wife, he strenuously denied any involvement in the Whitechapel murders. That doesn't mean he still isn't a decent suspect. In just a moment, we will move on with the most promising suspects, but please consider subscribing to this channel. More subscribers means more regular updates. Thank you. George Hutchinson. Hutchinson was a mysterious character who had made a statement to police that he'd encountered Mary Jane Kelly shortly before her death. He claimed that he had followed Kelly and another man to her home, observed the place for some time, and then left, intimating that he had seen the killer. It was thought that he was an attention seeker who was possibly looking to sell a story. But he placed himself at the scene of the crime, and was he trying to divert attention away from himself with his curious story? He was never properly investigated, and is an intriguing suspect. Joseph Barnett. Barnett was the ex-boyfriend of Mary Kelly. He was questioned about her murder, released, and not suspected. Yet Barnett also had a conceivable motive. For whatever reason, he was not thoroughly investigated. On the minus side, it would be unclear what motive he had to commit the other murders. David Cohen, or Nathan Kaminsky, depending on who you talk to, was a lunatic who was sent to Colney Hatch Asylum just after the final murder. Cohen was violent and had to be restrained constantly, but the evidence against him is only circumstantial and behavioural. James Kelly. Kelly had killed his wife, been deemed insane, but then escaped from Broadmoor Hospital. He was on the loose for the entirety of the Ripper timeline, though no one knows if he was in London. He fitted the psychological profile, but other than that, there is no direct evidence to link him with the crimes. Robert Mann. Historian May Troe first unveiled Whitechapel morgue attendant Robert Mann as a suspect in 2009. Mann worked at the mortuary where the victims were taken and disregarded instructions not to touch the corpses when they were brought in. He fitted both the FBI profile and the geographical profile, knew the area intimately, and was regarded when giving evidence as shifty and unreliable. As with so many suspects, he is a good fit, but without any direct evidence. James Maybrick. Maybrick shot into the Ripper consciousness in 1992 when the supposed diary of Jack the Ripper was uncovered, allegedly written by him. In the end, it was determined a forgery, but a pocket watch was also found, which was engraved with Maybrick's name, the words "I am Jack," and the initials of the victims. To date, electron microscope examinations have been unable to discount the markings as having been made later than the murders. Maybrick also travelled constantly, including to London, and his addiction to arsenic made him unstable and violent. Just because the diary was a forgery doesn't mean Maybrick isn't still a very interesting suspect. Francis Tumbledy, a quack American doctor who made a fortune peddling cure-alls and snake oil. Tumbledy is an intriguing suspect, a pathological hater of women, said to have collected female wombs. Tumbledy can be placed in London during the crimes. He was arrested for committing a homosexual act there and fled to America. Strangely, he was then pursued to the US by a Scotland Yard detective, despite that offence not being extraditable. US papers speculated that he was a suspect in the Ripper murders, though Scotland Yard would never confirm it. He remains a very intriguing suspect. Aaron Kosminski. Kosminski was a Polish Jew, admitted to Colney Hatch Asylum in 1891. He was strongly suspected by the police to the point that he was watched and followed. Assistant Commissioner of the Met Police, Sir Robert Anderson, later wrote that Kosminski had been identified by a witness as the Ripper, but the man refused to testify against him as he was a fellow Jew. Whilst the police have suspected plenty of innocent men in their time, the attention given to him surely counts for something. He is one of the best suspects. So what do I think? I've been convinced by so many suspects and theories over the years, only to be disappointed. But now my thinking has evolved. I believe that Charles Allen Lechmere killed Polly Nichols. I have no idea if he killed the other victims, which makes me seriously consider that there may have been more than one person killing women in Whitechapel. There must be doubt that only one man was responsible. So what do you think? Let me know in the comments section. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to consider subscribing.